Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show. I've been off the air for, a week, a little more than a week, and I'll tell you why. Because YouTube determined that my 300th video was potentially harmful to people. And how was it harmful? Of course, they don't give you particulars, but as far as I can tell, re-listening to it, it's because I quoted Rand Paul asking some questions of a certain American doctor whose first name begins with an F, and I mentioned a drug which begins with an I, and that is verboten, absolutely verboten. So I'm not going to make that mistake again. I suppose I'm going to have to seriously look at the alternatives to YT because they have arrogated to themselves the title of arbiters of truth. And anything that they disagree with is considered to be potentially harmful. So I don't know. I'm going to check out Rumble and some of these other sites. Because I guess it's I got one strike now, and it's only really a matter of time. But I was doing some thinking in my days off, and walking the streets of Victoria, when I see about a quarter of the people wearing masks outdoors, I want to shout at them, "What is wrong with you people? Why are you doing this?" Of course, we have in the United States this phenomenon of people who have been double vaccinated who are still wearing masks because they don't want people to think that they're Trump supporters. I'm not making this up. This is a real thing. And it's too funny. It reminds me of the late, great English satirist Peter Simple, who wrote of the Church of Jesus Christ, the non-smoker, certain radical adherents of which believe that those who have never smoked will never die. And you can easily adapt that to the Church of the double vaccinated, certain radical adherents of which believes that those who have been twice vaccinated will never die. Let's talk about insanity here. In the 1960s, the traditional Canadian patriotism, which was largely based on the British Empire and our connections from that, was deliberately destroyed by first Lester Pearson and then Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Trudeau, when he instituted the policy of multiculturalism in 1971, he explicitly argued against the concept of a Canadian identity. So what's left? Well, when Jean Chrétien was prime minister, the United Nations would trot out its list of best countries in the world, and somehow Canada ended up number one. I don't think it's number one anymore. And of course, the metrics by which the United Nations determining countries' worth is interesting in itself. But what we have now is just stasis, really. What does Canadian patriotism mean now? It means we're not Americans. That's simple. You can see this divergence with COVID-19 very strongly, that the United States, led by Texas and Florida, has opened up largely, and New York is opening up, and California is opening up. But in Canada, we have decided that no, we are not going to open up. Until when? I don't know. Maybe never. Here's a story which touches on this question, and it is from May the 15th, Chris Hall at CBC News, and it's about Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia's Premier Ian Rankin says he'll continue to use every legal means available to stop the spread of COVID-19 in the province, even if the effort ends up limiting individual rights. The province obtained a court injunction to halt a protest against its lockdown measures, which include keeping the border closed to non-essential travel and people attempting to move to the province along with hefty fines for anyone caught traveling outside the zone in which they live. I'll do whatever I have to do that's within the confines of the law and the public health emergency that we have in place to keep Nova Scotians safe, Rankin told the CBC. I recognize that people really value their freedom of expression, and I believe in all those things. But you can't take away the freedom for individuals to be able to live in a society where they're not fearful of contracting COVID. Well, Ian Rankin clearly does not believe in freedom of speech, freedom of expression, any kind of freedom. So just how it's a curious thing about these stories that, as of Friday, that would be, a little more than a week ago, the province had more than 1,530 active cases of COVID-19 and 21 patients in intensive care. So how many people live in Nova Scotia? Well, the estimate is 979,000 people. Let's take a look at the numbers here. These are the latest numbers as of today, May the 24th. New confirmed cases, 49. Cumulative confirmed cases, 5,335. Active cases, 894. Resolved cases, 4,362. Deaths, 79. 79. That is less than 10 a month. Patients in hospital, in the ICU wards, 19. In a province of almost 1 million people. And Ian Rankin has decided that this is such a crisis that individual rights no longer exist in the province. The injunction, according to the CBC, prevents a group called Freedom Nova Scotia from staging a planned protest rally today. The court also authorizes police to use reasonable force in arresting anyone who takes part in one of these protests. Nova Scotia introduced tighter restrictions last week after a sudden sharp increase in positive COVID-19 cases. It was a dramatic change in a province where the reported daily number of new cases had been in the single digits for months. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association wrote the Premier this week to say that closing the border to the rest of the country violates mobility rights guaranteed by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Well, it turns out that we do have Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but health bureaucrats, health wallas can simply say, no, you don't have any rights anymore. It's that simple. The Charter requires that when governments restrict rights, they do so in a manner that is minimally intrusive, wrote Association Director Cara Faith Zwibble. In the current circumstance, self-isolation can be effectively paired with testing requirements to mitigate risk. Completely excluding Canadians from the province is neither necessary nor appropriate. Rankin isn't backing down. He said it's clear that some people were ignoring the mandatory 14-day quarantine for visitors entering the province. So we took it to the next step and we had to lock our border down, he told the CBC. We didn't want to take that step, ho-ho, and it is causing disruption in the lives of people and families. We needed to do that, though, at the first of this outbreak in the Halifax region. Nova Scotia has one of the lowest vaccination rates among the provinces. Only about 38% of Nova Scotians have received their first doses. That pace has picked up in recent days. Again, let's look at the number of people who have died in Nova Scotia from COVID-19. It is 79. And how old is this epidemic? 16 months now? And 79 people have died. I guess it was Neil Ferguson who spilled the beans about this some months ago when he said that it was all about creating fear. If you created enough fear in people, then you could get a regime much like communist China. And the panic is, at least where I am, no signs of going away. Let's have a look at the chat. Hello to Palcasso88, to Head McNeck, Dan Tricky Who, Jogan666, Quachilango, and Steve. Double masked and two masks while alone in the car, says Steve. Hello to our valiant moderator, Chad Chadson. Thank you for your service. Metal Mike says experts now saying full vaccination will not stop a fourth wave. Actually, I had an idea for a novel called The 14th Lockdown. When it would begin, today was the first day of the 14th lockdown. Hello to Jason Quinn. Emma Nimpton, Canadian Identity, doing the opposite of what America does. Metal Mike says, Happy Victoria Day. A Toronto school, Queen Victoria Public School, is changing its name to oppose anti-Black racism. Canada is crumbling. Hello to John Thompson and Brulette Cracked. To Claire Caw. I've got to get the hell out of Ontario, says Mr. Chuck the Buck Norris. Yes, I'm reminded a line from the HBO series Silicon Valley, where Erlich Bachman is talking to a Chinese fellow, Jin Yang, and he says, we don't have the freedoms in California that you have in China. Palpicasso88 says, when KMG stopped tweeting for a few days, I thought that one of KMG's colorful neighbors had gotten to him. Yeah, I decided to take a holiday from the internet. One gets sick of opinions, especially one's own. But yeah, I'm back now. COVID has revealed large swaths of the establishment are impenetrably dumb, says Roulette Cracked. Well, yeah. You read the newspapers and there's not much news in them. How Canada is ever going to pay back all of the money that it has spent in this self-inflicted, this disaster, COVID-19 panic, and there's no talk about it. Oh, equalization system. How does that work when British Columbia and Alberta are broke now? But again, I suppose if we don't pay attention to it, we can pretend that the crisis does not exist. I came across a story from Jen Kirch in the Toronto Star, and this woman is described, her reporting focus, dating, relationships, pop culture, lifestyle. This is what's happened to the news. Back in the old days, there used to be a section of the newspaper called the Women's Page, and it was devoted to things like, cooking and household tips, dating, relationships, pop culture, lifestyle. Well, the Women's Page is now the news. That's what it is. Vaccine Etiquette 101. Go ahead and talk about it, but be wary of confusing anecdote with data, expert says. So have you got your vaccine yet? Seems to be the go-to question these days. This followed by asking which one, alongside an unsolicited reaction based on the dose. The person asking got, ooh, Moderna, you fancy girl. Look at you, one person exclaims. Ah, AstraZeneca, that's okay. At least you got yours, one says with a sympathetic head tilt. I'm a Pfizer girl, one friend gushed to me, head held high. I'm reminded, about a decade ago, a friend of mine, he asked me to counsel his younger brother who wanted to get into the journalism business. And my advice was short, which was don't, just don't. It's a dying profession. If you get into journalism now, typically you can expect to start at about $2,000 a month and work, 60, 70 hours a week. And you have to be connected at all times because your editor is going to call you up and he's going to demand 450 words on the Gossip Girl reboot in the next hour. That's what it's like to be in journalism now. Let's see. Jen, not Jennifer, but Jen continues. It should be obvious that we shouldn't be shaming or judging people based on their vax and instead be congratulating them for getting one, anyone, as soon as it's available. That said, what's less obvious is how to navigate these sorts of sensitive conversations. Is it okay to ask someone if they got it, where they got it, which they got, if they had side effects, and should you fake a response if you have nothing nice to say? Of course, a congrats is all well and good, but I can't help be reminded of a Sex and the City episode, because of course, in which Miranda fakes enthusiasm when told the sex of her baby to be, because she thought the clinician expected her to have some sort of performative response. I faked a sonogram, she tells Carrie later. Should we follow suit and feign enthusiasm? Again, this is a serious story in Canada's leading newspaper. As opinions can be quite varied in regards to vaccinations, I think it's best to tread lightly and ask people if they're comfortable talking about vaccinations and potential side effects, says psychotherapist Kelly Boss. It's also important to read the room and the relationship. She says medical decisions are normally considered private, but it's now a much more common topic for discussion given the current climate. It's important that we're respectful of others and check in on how they are feeling about their vaccination, she adds, and not assume anything or make statements that could be upsetting. She says to assume the best of people and that we all have reasons for whatever decisions we're making. Do act curious, as you can learn from others things that might help you understand even if you don't agree. Don't use sweeping generalizations and keep discussions respectful, as even if the person you were talking to shares your views, they might have loved ones who feel strongly another way and might not appreciate you painting those with another opinion with a wide brush, Boss said. She also says, don't lecture. Few people are persuaded by being yelled at or attacked for their beliefs. Though likely done in good fun, vaccine stereotypes have taken off on apps like TikTok, with people labeling Pfizer the hot girl vax and putting down others like AstraZeneca, which has gotten the worst PR. All of this chatter is causing misinformation. Hot girl vax. Yes, that is what we call the news now. Of course, I'm going to have to be careful about what I say on this subject, but let's have a look at lockdown skeptics. Almost 9,000 patients died within 28 days after catching COVID in English hospitals. Yes, hospitals are dangerous places, and more dangerous now probably than they have been in recent memory. Wuhan Institute of Virology researchers were in hospital with possible COVID-19 in November 2019, says U.S. intelligence report. But is that too late for a lab leak? And 15 Brits have suffered from blood clotting disorders after their second AstraZeneca COVID vaccine. Only 7% of loneliness support organizations have returned to normal service, according to a new review. Taking the average of 2019 and 2020, Sweden had lower mortality than both Denmark and Finland. Oh, here's a good one. National Health Service dental surgery waiting lists have gotten so long that patients are being forced to wait until 2024 for an appointment, according to a new report. Waiting lists were long before 2020 and have only been made worse by lockdowns. Some people, unable to wait in pain, have gone into debt to meet private dentistry bills, while others have turned to pulling their teeth out themselves and performing do-it-yourself fillings, according to the Daily Mail. How about that? A number of surgeries have thousands on their waiting lists, and others have closed their books to new patients. But some of the practices will offer an appointment within a week to those who can afford to pay privately, according to research by Health Watch England. Well, private medical care is legal in Britain. It is not legal in Canada. I believe that Canada shares this distinction with North Korea. I think it's Canada and North Korea are the only countries in the world where private medical care is not allowed. Britain's COVID epidemic will be over if vaccines work against Indian variant. Announcement on social distancing and mask wearing post-lockdown expected this week. That is from the British government. So, oh yes, here is another interesting story. Cancer crisis replacing COVID emergency as 300,000 miss urgent checks. England is at risk of replacing the COVID crisis with a cancer crisis, according to the London Telegraph, as official figures show that 304,000 fewer patients were given an urgent referral in the 12 months to March. Let's have a look at Alex Berenson's Twitter feed. Here we go. People. Headline of the day: people who want to defund police surprised murders are soaring. Yes, I'll have more to say about that later. How serious is the teen young adult COVID vaccine myocarditis issue? A single health system in the Northeast has told its physicians that it's had 9 cases, all in people under 30, 4 are in people under 21. The system has vaccinated around 50,000 people under 25. 18 cases in Connecticut that required hospitalization. That translates into about 1,700 cases nationally. Monica Gandhi, MD, MPH, tweets, I'm almost sure the Centers for Disease Control is dropping their outdoor masks for camps based on all the data from outside transmission being so low. I got a hint this will be done very soon. Berenson comments, because sciencey science, very soon. Soon, sciencey mask science, soon. Craig Spencer, MD, MPH. What does MPH stand for? He tweeted, maybe we're framing it wrong by touting opening up America again. It sounds like America is closed. Today, in great moments in COVID panic porn, Berenson comments, Craig Spencer tells you to hide inside. Trust him. He's a doctor and an MPH. Berenson tweets, and here, Vox secretly changes an article about the lab leak theory to make it less embarrassing. The post-publication changes places like Vox and the New York Times are making to articles are Orwellian in the most basic sense and need to be called out relentlessly. Any news organization that wants to be taken seriously needs to promise it will no longer do this, starting with the New York Times. Here's a medical-related story from Reuters. Concern over chemsex grows as COVID-19 shuts Thailand's alphabet people bars. People who attend chemsex parties face health risks, including overdoses, addiction, and HIV infection, campaigners say. Lockdown seen fueling chemsex parties among gay bi men. Yeah, they had to throw the bi men in there. Campaigners warn of risks from unprotected sex drugs. Chemsex users seeking help find scant official support. I don't want to go into too much detail about this because it's absolutely disgusting. But here's what chemsex is. It's when homosexual men decide to have sex nonstop for about a week. And in order to do this, they need to take drugs, a lot of drugs to keep this going. And they suffer injuries doing this, but the drugs, mask the pain from their self-inflicted injuries. Beam, apparently that's a name now, a gay sex worker, used to go to a chemsex party about once a month before the coronavirus pandemic shut Thailand's bars and clubs. But since then, the drug-fueled gatherings have become much more frequent. As Thailand grapples with a third COVID-19 wave, campaigners are warning of the health risks posed by an apparent increase in chemsex, where mainly gay, yes, and bisexual men meet to take drugs such as crystal meth or GHB, and unprotected sex is common. Beam, 34, who also works as a porn actor and regularly meets his clients at the parties, said changes to people's working routines under lockdown had made the gatherings more popular. It's now a golden opportunity for partygoers. Beam, who asked not to give his full name to protect his identity, told Thomson Reuters Foundation. Are there very many people in Thailand called Beam? I don't know. I shouldn't think so. Chemsex users are at risk of drug addiction or overdoses, as well as mental health problems, campaigners said. And Thai media have recently carried reports about chemsex-related violence, including physical assault. As in other parts of the world where authorities have voiced concern over the phenomenon, the parties are widely advertised on Twitter and gay dating apps like Blued and Grindr. At Bangkok Rainbow Organization, an LGBT plus NGO, the president, Nikorn Chimkong, said chemsex was now a new normal and that the trend was evident in an increase in inquiries about the pre-exposure prophylaxis PrEP, an anti-HIV drug. He said about 30 or 40 people per month contact the group every month nowadays to ask about the drug, a once-daily pill that protects people from becoming infected with the virus. That compares to less than 10 before the pandemic, with the majority taking the pills before chemsex parties. 3 current and former chemsex partygoers and experts supporting users said Thai public health providers lack the knowledge needed to support those seeking help for chemsex use. Elsewhere in Asia, too, there are no harm reduction programs that simultaneously address the risk of drug use and the sexual activity of gay, and bisexual men and transgender women, found a recent report by APCOM, a health advocacy group for gay and bi men. In Europe, where surveys in Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands have found that 30 to 45% of gay and bi men have engaged in chemsex at least once. Doctors warned in 2019 that the practice was refueling epidemics of HIV in urban areas. Earlier this year, Britain increased penalties for GHB, known as a date rape drug, following 2 high-profile trials, one of which detailed the drug's use in the rape of almost 50 men. Yes. And I suppose the lesson of all this is virtually normal. As Andrew Sullivan wrote, they are just like us, except they're not. Let's go back to the chat. Oscar Toe says, I wish I was a master of health. Yako Raipala, our Finnish friend, says the state compensated a bit, but not most of the cost of the private clinic. I feel weird to complain about free stuff, but the state propaganda is constantly telling us about our free health care. So, well, there are waiting lists in Canada for all sorts of procedures, especially heart procedures. And a fellow I knew told me some time ago that his father-in-law was on a waiting list. I think it was 2 or 3 years because of his wonky heart. And his family decided that he probably wasn't going to survive the wait list. So they did a whip round and gathered together $50,000, and they sent him across the border to Montana, and he got fixed up within a week. You know, when Enoch Powell was Minister of Health in the 1950s in Britain, he came to the grim conclusion that the budget for the National Health Service, it could be 100% of the entire British budget. And so what does that mean? It means rationing. And this is what we have in Canada because the demand for free, so-called free health services is almost unlimited. KMG, was the Korean War a mistake? Well, I believe it was, Avril Harriman, Secretary of the State for the United States, who basically invited North Korea to invade the South, essentially saying that, well, the United States was not going to respond. And so North Korea did invade, and Truman did respond. And of course, MacArthur brought the fight to the other side, to the north, and they conquered all the way to the Chinese border, and then the Chinese invaded based on stolen American documents, which a communist, Guy Burgess, had procured for the Soviet Union. Of course, Truman took the position that we're just going to ignore that we are now fighting China and the Soviet Union. And of course, it wasn't a war. It was a police action as Truman said, which inaugurated the now long American tradition of not fighting wars to win them. 1467, Masterson Wilson says, you Canucks always tell us how great your health care is. Every instance of major issues, you come to the Yanks states. Well, Dan Ellison says, I'm in Florida, all health insurance paid up, and I've been trying to get a colonoscopy since last year. They treat you're like a flea. The Chosin Reservoir, says Chogan 666. Yeah, that's where the Marines saved the day, because the U.S. Army didn't put up a very good show there. Their commander pretty much had a nervous breakdown after the Chinese invasion. Jay Miller says the Cambridge Five cocked up the Korean War. Indeed. Oscar Toe says, I swear we make up the weirdest usernames just so Kevin says them. Guy Burgess says, Anne Run. Now, there was a man who would have loved chem-sex. Someone mentions Kim Philby. Let's see. What else do we have here? It doesn't sound very fun to make sex a vocation so rigorous one must do drugs to sustain it. Yes, that's exactly the point. It becomes a grim duty. You know, where you have to take meth and date rape drugs, to keep going for a week. It doesn't sound like much fun at all. And this is really more of a psychological thing than a sexual thing. So, moving on. Oh, yeah, I've been thinking about this. I used to be in the news business, that there's two worlds out there. There's the world that gets reported, and there's the other world, the inside world, that doesn't get reported. Here's a story from LifeSite, which is Dr. Micah Hickson. It's both shocking and not shocking. Time magazine gave journalists $20,000 per month to host progressivist parties during Vatican II. The U.S. secular Time magazine hosted luxurious gatherings throughout the 1962 to 65 Vatican II sessions with numerous influencers in order to push the council in a more progressivist direction. Yes, I remember reading about this, in the 70s. Coffee. Journalists would get together, particularly Time magazine and the Washington Post were the leaders in this. Dr. Robert Moynihan, a veteran journalist and Vatican expert, has published an article in which he relates what a Time magazine journalist revealed to him in 2004. The now deceased Robert Blair Kaiser told Moynihan that he was sent by Time's Claire Booth and Henry Luce to the Second Vatican Council in Rome with a budget of $20,000 per month so that he could host parties for the participants of and journalists reporting on the council. See, what would happen would be that Time and the Washington Post in particular would write stories. Basically, they were wish lists of everything that they wanted Vatican II to accomplish. And people read these stories and, I guess that's what has to happen. As Kaiser told Moynihan, he had rented an intentionally large apartment in Rome. He also said that he had met with the Luce couple before coming to Rome. They had hoped, he said, the residence would become a place where ideas could be exchanged among council participants. He added, they gave me a generous Time magazine expense account, $20,000 each month. That's about $400,000 in today's money, to hold regular dinner parties in my large apartment. As he told Moynihan, he and his wife would often host 50 or 100 journalists and monsignors, priests and bishops, and diplomats, sometimes during the week, sometimes on the weekend. The purpose of these gatherings was clear. It was not only to share information, but as Moynihan reports, to provide a space where the agenda of a more open church could be freely discussed, Kaiser said. That is to say, the U.S. secular Time magazine hosted luxurious gatherings throughout the 1962 to 65 Vatican II sessions with numerous influencers in order to push the council in a more progressivist direction. As Moynihan says, Kaiser quickly became one of the most influential journalists in the city. His coverage of the Second Vatican Council set a standard and tone and line. The line was that the Catholic Church was undergoing a revolution which would change the church profoundly. Moynihan also quotes from Kaiser's published account of his work during the council. In his book, A Clerical Error, 2002, Kaiser wrote, "Our spacious apartment with its huge picture windows and sparkling marble floors became something of a gathering place for conciliar progressives." Kaiser continues to describe how they had practically every other night of the week a small dinner party with 8 people. These dinners then grew into large gatherings that were called the Kaiser's Sunday Nights, which regularly included the journalists from the Jesuit weekly America. Among the other guests were also Archbishop Thomas D'Estaing Roberts, S.J. of Bombay, India, who was of British descent. He and other fellow prelates, according to Kaiser, thought and said out loud that the church was overloaded with excess baggage, myth, superstition, and nonsense. With him, they voted on all the important reforms of Vatican II, most of which tended to make the church less Roman and more Catholic. Dr. Moynihan puts this Time magazine story in connection with Pope Benedict XVI's own February 14, 2013 speech, according to which there had been purportedly 2 councils, the one of the media and the other of the council fathers. The Vatican expert adds that we urgently need a more full and accurate understanding of what happened at Vatican II in order to continue the task of receiving the council and interpreting it in the light of the perennial doctrine of the church handed down from the beginning. This revelation from Dr. Moynihan can also be seen in light of Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano's own statements, in which he himself stresses that the Second Vatican Council was manipulated. For example, in response to questions from LifeSite editor-in-chief John Henry Weston, the Italian prelate wrote last year that the council from its origin was made the object of a grave manipulation by a 5th column that penetrated into the very heart of the church, that perverted its purposes as confirmed by the disastrous results that are before everyone's eyes. Somewhere else, he spoke of a very deceptive project to infiltrate in some way into the church, and that this project was linked with Freemasonry. Moreover, Archbishop Vigano, in his interview with LifeSite about the abolition of the oath against modernism that took place in 1967, very shortly after the end of the Second Vatican Council, stated, "If we apply Antonio Gramsci's recommendations to what happened in the heart of the church in the last century, we can see that the work of conquering the ecclesiastical casemates was conducted with the same subversive methods. Certainly the infiltration of the deep state into civil institutions and of the deep church into Catholic institutions corresponds to this criterion." We might ask, for example, where the Luce's $20,000 monthly checks really came from, and whether this operation had any links to the U.S. government, since Time and the Luce couple had been rumored to have ties with U.S. intelligence. David Wemhoff, the author of the book John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, and the American Proposition, clearly indicates that this was the case. In his book's introduction, it says that media mogul Henry R. Luce, founder and publisher of enormously influential magazines like Time and Life, used the CIA's doctrinal warfare program to turn the Catholic Church into a promoter of American ideas, such as the idea of religious liberty. Pope Benedict XVI, the former Cardinal Ratzinger, of course, came to deeply regret the Second Vatican Council, but of course he was up to it. He was in it up to his neck. He was one of the very influential doctrinal experts during the Second Vatican Council. He later came up with this idea of the hermeneutic of a continuity, it was called, which was an attempt basically to say that, the Second Vatican Council wasn't a disaster, which of course it was. But now we learn a little bit about the truth there, which is to say that the fix was in right from the beginning. I'd mentioned journalism as a dying profession, and that leads me to a story on Substack by Freddie DeBoer. It's all just displacement. Blue check marks are mourning bad careers in a broken industry. He begins, displacement is a psychological defense mechanism in which a person redirects a negative emotion from its original source to a less threatening recipient. A classic example of the defense is displaced aggression. If a person is angry but cannot direct their anger toward the source without consequences, They might take out their anger on a person or thing that poses less of a risk. Media Twitter does not hate Substack because it's pretending to be a platform when it's a publisher. They don't hate it because it's filled with anti-woke white guys. They don't hate it because of harassment or any such thing. I don't think they really hate it at all. Substack is a small and ultimately not very relevant outpost in a vastly larger industry. They may not like it, but it's not important enough for them to hate it. What do they hate? They hate where their industry is, and they hate where they are within their industry. But that's a big problem that they don't feel like they can solve. If you feel you can't get mad at the industry that's impoverishing you, it's much easier to get mad at the people who you feel are unjustly succeeding in that industry. Trying to cancel Glenn Greenwald again because he criticizes the media harshly, trying to tarnish Substack's reputation so that cool, paid-up writer types leave it and the bad types like me get kicked off, that they can maybe do. Confronting their industry's future with open eyes, too scary, especially for people who were raised to see success as their birthright and have suddenly found that their degrees and their witheringly dry one-liners do not help them when the rent comes due. Things are bad, folks, Freddie DeBoer writes. U.S. newspaper circulation fell in 2018 to its lowest level since 1940, the first year with available data. Total daily newspaper subscription circulation, print and digital combined, was an estimated 28.6 million for weekday and 30.8 million for Sunday in 2018. Those numbers were down 8% and 9% respectively from the previous year. Both figures are now below their lowest recorded levels, though weekday circulation first passed this threshold in 2013. Newspaper revenues declined dramatically between 2008 and 2018. Advertising revenue fell from $37.8 billion in 2008 to $14.3 billion in 2018, a 62% decline. Newsroom employment at U.S. newspapers dropped by nearly half, 47%, between 2008 and 2018, from about 71,000 to 38,000. Newspapers drove a broader decline in overall U.S. newsroom employment during that span. Layoffs continue to pummel U.S. newspapers. Roughly a quarter, 27% of papers with an average Sunday circulation of 50,000 or more, experienced layoffs in 2018. The layoffs came on top of the roughly one-third, 31% of papers in the same circulation range that experienced layoffs in 2017. What's more, the number of jobs typically cut by newspapers in 2018 tended to be higher than in the year before. For years, prominent digital media companies had reported double-digit percentage gains in ad revenue. That fact may no longer be the case. In a surprising ad spending analysis, eMarketer forecasts in a first, Google, the senior partner in the digital duopoly and one of the largest media companies in the world, will see a fall-off in ad dollars in 2020. In April 2020, Standard Media Index had reported that Google generated more ad revenue from national brands in the U.S. than any other media company, replacing Disney for the top spot. DeBoer comments, life in the content industry already sucks. A small handful of people make bank while the vast majority hustle relentlessly just to hold on to the meager pay they already receive. There are staff writers at big-name publications who produce thousands of words every week and make less than $40,000 a year for their trouble. There are permanent employees of highly prestigious newspapers and magazines who don't receive health insurance. Venues close all the time. Mourning another huge round of layoffs is a regular bonding experience for people in the industry. Writers have to constantly job hop just to try and grind out an extra $1,500 a year, making their whole lives permanent job interviews where they can't risk offending their potential bosses and peers. Many of them dream of selling that book to save themselves financially, not seeming to understand that book advances have fallen 40% in 10 years. The median figure is now $6,080, and that the odds of actually making back even that meager advance are slim, meaning most authors are making less than minimum wage from their books when you do the math. They have to tweet constantly for the good of their careers, or so they believe, which amounts to hundreds of hours of unpaid work a year. Their publications increasingly strong-arm them into churning out pathetic pop culture ephemera like listicles about the outfits on WandaVision. They live in fear of being the one to lose out when the next layoffs come and the game of media musical chairs spins up once again. They have to pretend to like ghouls like Ezra Klein and Jonah Peretti and make believe that there's such a thing as the Daily Beast reputation for excellence. Freddie DeBoer says, I've always felt bad for them despite our differences because of these conditions, and they have a right to be angry. But they don't have much in the way of self-awareness about what their anger really lies. A newsletter company hosting Barry Weiss is why you can't pay your student loans. You sure? They'll tell you about the terrible conditions in their industry themselves when they're feeling honest. So what are they really mad about? That I'm making a really just decent guaranteed wage for just 1 year, or that this decent wage is the kind of money many of them dream of making, despite the fact that in their minds they've done everything right and played by all the rules? Is their anger really about a half dozen guys whose writing you have to actively seek out to see? Or do they need some place to put the rage and resentment that grows inside them as they realize, no, it's not getting better. This is all I get. You know, it would seem that the newspaper publishing industry and the book industry, for that matter, they didn't learn any lessons from the music industry. The music industry went digital in the 1980s, which meant that it was possible to make perfect copies of copyrighted songs, which then began to be traded over the internet after the World Wide Web was introduced in 1995. And you have the phenomenon of YouTube, where you can find pretty much every song in the world available for free. So if you're going to make every song in the world available for free, then who is going to buy music? The newspaper industry and the book industry went digital as well, which meant that it was possible to make perfect copies of their copyrighted material so people could get the news for free. And in the 1990s, the news industry very strangely decided to give away their material for free over the internet. Now, there have been some holdouts, Rupert Murdoch's publications. The Times is a holdout. Now, many newspapers have, they're behind a paywall, but in most cases, it's easy enough to bust this paywall. You simply open up the story in Tor, and there you have it for free. Of course, another thing that happened was it was discovered beginning in the 1990s that there were a whole bunch of people who were willing to write for free. And again, you cannot compete with free. You just can't. And so, as I say, the result now is that people get into the newspaper business and they are paid about $2,000 a month in order to work 60, 70 hours a week and to write, inane stories about The Bachelor or Bachelorette or Gossip Girl or the Friends reboot. Paul Johnson famously said nothing beats news in a newspaper, but if you look at most newspapers now, there's precious little news in them. You find all this stuff. Essentially, newspapers are retailing gossip that was on the internet 24 or 36 hours earlier. Why would anyone pay money to buy stale gossip? But that's what newspapers trade in now. Let's go back to the chat. Didn't even put a date on show a title. Roulette Crack says their failed experiment is unraveling and they are cannibalizing themselves. Ha 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 ha. Quachalango says wanted to listen to Scarlet Street review. Oh, I guess I talked about that when I used to be on with Luke Ford. Oh, it's Bob Dylan's 80th birthday today, I believe. Happy birthday to Mr. Dylan. Someone mentions his song, The Mighty Quinn. When you look at Bob Dylan's success, one of the reasons for it was, he was signed by Columbia Records in 1961, something like that. And he was called John Hammond's Folly. because who's going to buy these records? Well, his records didn't. It was just the beginning. It was just him and his guitar. They hardly cost any money to make. But Dylan had the advantage of really aggressive marketing by his publishing companies, such that all of these people were making hits of Bob Dylan songs, including Manfred Mann and the Byrds and all manner of people. Dylan eventually became a huge seller, but he was making bank pretty much from the beginning. Let's see, Star Rover says limited payment market for news orgs that are now known for regularly publishing fabricated or inaccurate articles. Hello to Mark Raymond. Steve says we traffic in gossip and moral hysteria. China builds computer companies and lands probes on the moon. Hello to Ricardo Williams. Bob Dylan's voice is an acquired taste. I wasn't a Dylan fan during the 60s. I suppose the reason for that was the 70s. I just associated him with people showing up at parties with an acoustic guitar. There was always one or two guys at every party that bring out the acoustic guitar and sing terrible, terrible versions of Bob Dylan songs. Thankfully, that's a trend that didn't last. Let's go. Oh, yeah. Speaking of the journalism, here, just let me open this up. This is too funny. I'm just thinking, John Lukács, the late Hungarian-American historian, he talked about historical consciousness and the lack of it. Let's see, a woman called Michelle Kosinski, she describes herself as writer, host, storyteller, believer in real democracy. I've covered the White House, State Department, and the world for news. Now I make things I'd watch. How naive is this woman? Well, here's a tweet from her. As an American journalist, you never expect your own government to lie to you repeatedly, your own government to hide information the public has a right to know, your own government to spy on your communications. Trump's un-American regime did all of these. No one should accept this. Oh, has she ever heard of Edward Snowden? That he revealed that Obama was spying on everybody illegally, but apparently Trump is responsible for this. You never expect your government to lie to you repeatedly. Did she ever heard of Woodrow Wilson? Does she know that Woodrow Wilson had a stroke and that Mrs. Wilson was effectively president of the United States for 18 months? Does she know that Franklin Roosevelt was dying when he ran for his fourth term in 1944, but the media was too scared to mention this? Claire Booth Luce did, and she got into an enormous amount of trouble over this. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt's debilitation meant handing over half of Europe to the communists. But no, it was just best, the media decided to keep silent about this. Have you ever heard of a Gulf of Tonkin and what happened there? Where the U.S. Navy blew up a bunch of water and then claimed to use this as an excuse to drag America into the Vietnam War, that the American government lied for years and years. Oh, yeah, we have a path to winning the Vietnam War. And there was no path to winning. They just sent soldiers over to Vietnam to die. And for what? This woman is so naive that she doesn't know that governments have always lied to people. Has you ever heard of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, in which the media, led by Judith Miller at the New York Times, bought hook, line, and sinker the entirely fraudulent claim that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction? Now, Judith Miller was kind of made a scapegoat for this. But what about all the other people? What about all the other reporters and the opinion journalists who lied their heads off? Did any of them get fired? David Frum is still employed, as far as I can see, still taken seriously. And he was wrong. He was wrong about everything. But that doesn't seem to matter. Here's an essay by William Briggs, statistician to the stars. Our coming murder and crime wave. In 2020, we saw a large increase in murders. Homicides were up 30% from 2019, an increase which is called historic. Gun assault and aggravated assault rates climbed 8% and 6% respectively. Most of the increase that linked report demonstrates came from large cities, such as where the Black Lives Matter riots took place. The precipitous rise in murders during the emergence of civil unrest and protests following George Floyd's death are admitted. The riots have declined, but summer is ahead of us. And even if riots aren't repeated, given the apologia for the murders and other violent crime by our rulers and media, and the lack of desire to punish crime, crime will only increase. Though crime might not hit peak 2020 levels in 2021, though some say it will rise from 2019 levels and increase from there. Using history as a guide, most of these increases will be in black crime. Most of this will be black on black crime, but black on non-black will also increase. According to official FBI statistics, blacks committed 40 to 69% of all murders in 2019. The 40 to 69% range is because 29% of all murderers have an unknown race. Assuming none of these are black gives 40%. Assuming all gives 69%. You have to be careful because race is often unknown when the criminal is not arrested. Arrest numbers percentages therefore differ. So, what is going to be the result of this? Well, what does Ezra Klein have to say about this? Apparently, murders increasing is a bad thing, but even worse than that is a rise in populism. Yeah, I'm not making this up. This is how people like Ezra Klein think. He writes, violent crime is spiking. Homicides in cities were up by 20 to 40% in 2020, the largest single-year increase since 1960, and 2021 isn't looking any better. This is a crisis on its own terms, but it's also a crisis for the broader liberal project in two downstream ways. Yes, that's the real crisis. First, violent crimes supercharges inequality. Families who can flee do. Businesses close or never open. Banks won't make loans. Property values plummet. Children are traumatized with lifelong impacts on stress and cognition. Second, fear of violence undermines liberal politics. Oh dear. Just look at America post 9/11 or after the crime surges of the 70s and 80s and 90s. Strongmen politicians win, punitive responses like mass incarceration and warrior policing rise. Social trust collapses. Yes, the liberal project, which has led to the death or effective death of America's great cities. American journalists might talk about no-go areas in parts of Europe, but there are all manner of no-go areas in America where no sane person would ever find himself. But that's not the subject that the media is much interested in. But here's the good news. Larry Krasner survived his primary challenge in Philadelphia. Whew. But we are seeing other signs, according to Ezra Klein. Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms isn't running for re-election after being attacked by challengers as soft on crime. Chesa Boudin is facing a recall effort in San Francisco. Yes. Do they still have laws in California? What is it? You won't be charged for stealing up to $850, I believe. Lots of restaurants, even before COVID-19, had closed in California as a result. That let's say you have a big dinner with wine, and your bill is $200 or $300, and you just leave the restaurant, and you're not going to be charged because apparently in California they don't need laws anymore. Violence is the second most important issue, according to Ezra Klein, to Democrats in the New York City mayoral primary, behind coronavirus, but ahead of housing affordability and racial inequality. The politics of this could really tip, and not just in cities, if these numbers keep getting worse. Then, as with Nixon and Reagan in the 70s and 80s, it could bring law and order, in scare quotes, conservatives, including Trump, back to power in 2024. More than that, crime should be an issue liberals focus on eagerly. People deserve to be safe from crime and safe from state violence. That's foundational to a good life. Too often, they're given a choice between one or the other, and it's often a false choice at that. So, the good news, according to Ezra Klein, is we know a lot more about what works to prevent violent crime, both in terms of policing and in terms of other institutions we can and should build. And we're not in an age of austerity. No, they're just helicoptering money to the banks. There's a lot we can do and should do, but we need to do it fast. I've been hearing this argument since the 1960s that, oh, we need to address the root causes of crime, which means more federal programs. And how has that worked out? According to Ezra Klein, one central piece of this response should be seriously investing in community organization and violence interruption programs that have been proven again and again to work. The American Jobs Act includes that, though it doesn't get much press. Yes, okay. More money. We can change human nature by spending more money. You know, as I've been saying for quite some time on this live stream, a disastrous opinion has become mainstream now in the United States, which is that the entire justice system of the United States is illegitimate because America was a nation that was built on slavery. Therefore, Black people cannot be held responsible for their acts. And it is more of a crime for a police officer to arrest a Black man than for the crime itself. Now, I don't think that Ezra Klein has worked this through because he's not the sort of person that works things through. But when the elite of a country essentially tells 13% of the population that, no, there's nothing that you can do that can be considered criminal because of our past treatment of you, this is inviting a crime wave. Here's a piece from Angelo Codevilla in American Greatness called Regime versus Regime. Again, this is a rather unreported story, but you can guess why. Codevilla begins the attempt of America's ruling class to convict 455 persons of armed insurrection, i.e. of waging war against the United States, a species of treason, for protesting insufficient scrutiny of the 2020 election on January 6th in the Capitol, while at the same time it excuses and even cheers the burning and looting of courthouses, police stations, and downtowns all over America, is not the exercise of a double standard. The people in and out of government who do this are not corrupt. Instead, acting as part of the regime, the oligarchy, they are replacing the American Republic and waging war to crush its remains. The sooner Americans realize that we are being governed by people at war with our Constitution and contemptuous of ourselves, the sooner those people may be treated as the enemies they are. In the Washington Post, the Justice Department explained why the words of its indictments of those it claims trespassed on the Capitol will not result in the severe prison sentences they imply. Those words try to fit acts prima facie of mostly peaceful protest into the Democratic Party's and associated oligarchies' narratives of armed insurrection against our democracy. But in the Post story, these legal experts mention regretfully that their best efforts notwithstanding, what remains of the U.S. legal system cannot wholly erase the fact that trespassing is still only trespassing, even in the U.S. Capitol, and that a misdemeanor is still only a misdemeanor. Nevertheless, these prosecutors and friendly experts fill most of the article with how they combine unlimited pre-trial detention under harsh circumstances and limitation of legal assistance to press the accused to accept maximum penalties and to forego bringing cases to juries. Keeping evaluation of cases within the administrative judicial system out of the hands of the accused peers is an essential part of suppressing the reality of what happened and did not happen on January the 6th. forcing the accused to plead guilty to charges formulated according to the narrative that white supremacist Americans unlawfully obstructed the 2020 election is essential to establishing the validity of that fraudulent political claim. That, in turn, is an essential weapon in the oligarchy's attack on the American Republic and its supporters. Reality is the opposite. The oligarchy itself committed the only unlawful acts of interference during the 2020 election. Anyone looking for evidence of oligarchic interference may begin with Time magazine's February 4th story, The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election. Today's Justice Department, acting as part and parcel of the oligarchy that calls itself our democracy, has pushed partisanship to the point of war by one regime in favor of another. Inevitably, this has created the horrid reality of political prisoners among us, people who are being punished for supporting the republic against the oligarchy. When regimes war on each other, whose side are you on becomes the practical definition of justice. The following shows that the oligarchy's system of justice consists precisely of negating what the U.S. Constitution defines as right. The founders passed the Bill of Rights, especially the 4th through 8th Amendments, precisely to place the judicial power's capacity to hurt individuals ultimately and firmly in the hands of the people. They did it to prevent those in power from using that power to cow opposition and force support. But that is exactly what the regime that calls itself our democracy is doing. Consider, Codavia writes, the Fourth Amendment prohibits officials from searching a person or his home and papers without prior consent or a legal order. A warrant must be based on probable cause or reasonable suspicion of criminal behavior. It must also be very specific in describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. The Fourth Amendment is intended not just to prevent bothersome fishing expeditions into innocent matters. It also means to outlaw using investigations themselves as a form of punishment and intimidation. And yet first, the Justice Department and now regime-friendly judges have used and are using investigations to draw a dragnet through American society to embarrass, punish, and chill countless persons who are or may be opposed to the oligarchy's desires. Having been at the Capitol on January 6th, or merely in Washington, D.C., has been enough to earn a SWAT team's intrusion and trashing of one's home. Other departments of government, including the armed forces, plus any number of corporations, examine social media posts for heterodox views. Though punishment does not always result, spreading fear always does, which is the main point. The Fifth Amendment's prohibition of compulsory self-incrimination was meant to prevent officials from pressuring suspects into admitting guilt for crimes they did not commit. Guilt and innocence were supposed to be determined at trial. The modern American justice system relies almost entirely on overcharging offenses and then discounting them to obtain a guilty plea. The truth of what really happened be damned. This has placed dictatorial discretion in officials' hands, resulting in laxity for socio-political favorites and oppression for those out of favor. Misuse of the plea bargain system is playing a major role in the oligarchy's attack on the republic, because the oligarchs are combining it with neglect of the Sixth Amendment's guarantee of a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury to hear and question witnesses and to be defended by a lawyer. Trials for the events of January 6 are not to begin until at least some 9 months after the fact, on no particular schedule. During this lengthy and indeterminate time, the accused are held in solitary confinement under conditions harsher than most murderers ever experience. Their lives have already been ruined, and for what? The pressure on them is enormous to sign anything and at least set a date by which their nightmare will end. This is possible because the Justice Department also acts in defiance of the Eighth Amendment, which protects against excessive bail or fines. The Constitution's framers assumed that all but a few dangerous defendants would be granted bail, money pledged in exchange for the promise to appear for trial. Overheated rhetoric aside, none of the persons arrested in connection with January 6 actually injured anyone or have a history of injuring anyone. The allegation that they are dangerous is purely a political one, and the purpose of denying them bail is all too obviously to pressure them to support a political narrative and to warn the oligarchy's potential opponents of what the administrative system has in store for them. Angelo Codavia continues, the Eighth Amendment also forbids cruel or unusual punishment. What might that be for trespassing? What is cruel or an unusual punishment for disagreeing with the socio-political agenda of powerful people? The Bill of Rights has long since applied to the states, erasing the distinction between what had been public and private, between the powers of those in political office and those of corporations, institutions, etc., is oligarchy's essence. Arguably, the imposition of very cruel penalties on persons out of step with people and institutions that are part of the ruling oligarchy is contemporary America's most prominent feature. These include deletion of careers and livelihoods, public imputations of racism, etc. They amount to something like outlawry. And for what, specifically? Loud and clear is the ruling narrative. Our democracy is under armed assault by hordes of white supremacists who lurk throughout society, ready to unleash another deadlier version of January 6th. But the reality is that trespassing is still only trespassing. Codevilla concludes, the good aspect of it is that we who swear to uphold the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, owe no allegiance whatever to the oligarchy that now runs this country, nor can we persuade them about right and wrong. If we are to avoid becoming the oligarchy's mere subjects, we can and must treat them as the enemies they are, deny their legitimacy, and rebuild the republic amongst those of us who love it. A strange situation, Canada and the United States now, where you have Jews being hunted down in the streets of Toronto, Montreal, New York City. And once again, I'm reminded of a conversation I had years ago with Paul Gottfried when I asked him, when is the Jewish establishment ever going to drop the ridiculous idea that bringing millions of Muslims to America, Canada, wherever, is a good idea? And he said, never. And it would appear that he is correct. If you go to the Toronto Star, their opinion pages, you could find Bernie Farber, who was the former leader of the Canadian Jewish Congress, an organization that no longer exists, but he's a professional anti-racist, so he's found another spot, railing against Israeli apartheid and calling for a two-nation solution. Well, that's not going to happen. It's never going to happen. Treason is a word that we hear a lot of, and just an astonishing story on Axios. Jonathan Swan and Zachary Basu, Trump's war with his generals. So, yes, Trump wanted to end forever wars. Let's see, one important piece is now only beginning to emerge. Former President Donald Trump's last-minute bid to pull U.S. forces from Afghanistan and swaths of the Middle East, Africa, and even Europe ahead of Joe Biden's inauguration, and why he blinked. John McEntee, one of Donald Trump's most favored aides, handed retired Army Colonel Douglas McGregor a piece of paper with a few notes scribbled on it. He explained, this is what the president wants you to do. 1, get us out of Afghanistan. 2, get us out of Iraq and Syria. 3, complete the withdrawal from Germany. And 4, get us out of Africa. It was November 9th, 2020, days after Trump lost his re-election bid, 10 weeks before the end of his presidency, and just moments after McGregor was offered a post as senior advisor to acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller. As head of the powerful Presidential Personnel Office, McEntee had Trump's ear. Even so, McGregor was astonished. He told McEntee he doubted they could do all these things before January 20th. Then do as much as you can, McEntee replied. In McGregor's opinion, Miller probably couldn't act on his own authority to execute a total withdrawal of U.S. military forces from Afghanistan because he was serving in an active capacity. If this was for real, McGregor told McEntee, then he was going to need an order from the president. The one-page memo was delivered by courier to Christopher Miller's office 2 days later on the afternoon of November the 11th. The order arrived seemingly out of nowhere, and its instructions, signed by Trump, were stunning. All U.S. military forces were to be withdrawn from Somalia by December 30th, 2020. And how many Americans know that America still has troops in Somalia? All U.S. forces were to be withdrawn from Afghanistan by January 15th, 2021. What the fuck is this, Miller wondered. A former Green Beret, Miller had directed the National Counterterrorism Center and was accustomed to following process. Trump had tapped him to run the Pentagon after his unceremonious firing by tweet of Mark Esper. It was Miller's third day on the job. News of the memo spread quickly throughout the Pentagon. A top military brass, including Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Mark Milley, were appalled. This was not the way to conduct policy, with no consultation, no input, no process for gaming out consequences or offering alternatives. A call was quickly placed to White House counsel Pat Cipollone. In turn, Cipollone notified the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien. Neither Cipollone nor O'Brien had any idea what the order was or where it had come from. Neither did the office of the staff secretary, whose job it was to vet all the paper that reached the president's desk. Yet the paper bore Trump's distinctive Sharpie signature. The U.S. government's top national security leaders soon realized they were dealing with an off-the-books operation by the commander-in-chief himself. Many would rally to push back, sometimes openly and in coordination, at other times so discreetly that top Trump administration officials had to turn to classified intercepts from the National Security Agency for clues. Yes, last year was the year in which we learned that apparently the deep state does exist, and the deep state is a good thing because the deep state prevented, among other things, Donald Trump from acting as commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. The president says, do this, and the generals say, no, we don't want to, so we'll lie about it. We will slow roll it. We'll lie about how many troops we have in different places. And apparently, this is less of a problem than a few hundred people entering the Capitol building on January the 6th of this year. Again, I have to say, astonishing story. But, generals refusing orders from civilian commanders? Well, if they're opposing something that Donald Trump wants, then obviously this is a good thing. Let's see. Quachalango says, so Liz Warren is standing up for all these political prisoners more than almost all Republicans. How about that? John S., well, thank you for your praise. Rustin Shackelford says the Constitution means whatever the people in charge say it means. Well, again, Canada didn't have a Bill of Rights until 1982. And you see the failure of positivist law. Oh, we have all these rights guaranteed to us in Canada. But the Premier of Nova Scotia says no one's allowed to protest his lockdown. And the court's going to disagree with that? No, because they have decided that hysteria over COVID-19 means that we don't have rights in this country anymore. The number of churches closed down, seized by the state, the number of pastors imprisoned, it's getting to be a lengthy list in Canada. But since our elite hates Christianity, again, this is not a subject that the media is pretty much interested in. And as in my own city of Victoria, the churches still remained shut. So again, I have to ask, are these priests still being paid? If so, why? Is the Bishop of Victoria still drawing a salary? Teardrop Explodes. Okay. Treason, also a great pop song by the Teardrop Explodes. His book on Krautrock. Oh, okay. His best achievement, though, but great pop. Steve says democracy is a facade. We have no ability to vote against the people who have real power. It's a strange story in The Spectator by a woman called Zoe Strimple. Why are young men so scared of sex? Sexting has taken the place of sex. Now, of course, we're warned against anecdotal evidence. But this woman, Zoe Strimple, apparently she has problems finding a sexual partner. And, well, this makes it a trend. Sweeping statements like, why are young men so scared of sex? I don't know, maybe they're simply scared of sex with her. She begins, I am tired. Yes, so just in case you didn't know that a woman had written this. They're also tired, mostly exhausted. Men, purportedly single and ready to mingle, have worn me out, not sadly in the way one might hope, but in the new, peculiar, nightmarish way of the times. Since becoming single 2.5 years ago, I have romped around a fair bit on the apps, Bumble, Tinder, and lately Hinge. Interestingly, the only men who have seemed raring to go, and interesting, educated, and good-looking, were under 25. Too young to have become the unwanted dregs, they are also too young to worry that an older woman, I'm 38, will badger them about kids. So what this woman is saying is that she is offering consequence-free sex, but she can't get any men interested in her. Perhaps she might want to look inward. She continues, at first I was dazzled by the idea of dating younger men, but the reality soon dawned on me. For younger men, a life lived so much online has rendered offline life superfluous. It is an inconvenience. It is therefore almost impossible to arrange a date, let alone get any further than that. I'd like to think that some of this reluctance has been caused by the Me Too movement, which advocates righteous behavior, boundaries, and enthusiastic consent. With so much to get wrong, maybe it's easier to keep your distance. But the reality feels more craven. Time after time, a conversation will start, move to WhatsApp, and go one of three ways. One is simply that the conversation grinds abruptly to a halt. Another is a series of questions demanding answers too detailed and tiresome for tapping out on a phone to a stranger, and far more suited to discussing over a drink. In these conversations, messages veer from requests for info on what you did on the weekend to requests for your life story. Without the prospect of a drink, the conversation then dies, or they hang forever in the ether. On Christmas Day, Zoe confides, no fewer than 8 20-something men got in touch. Most of the men I had met on dating apps. I'd only met 3. The rest had been kicking around in my DMs, as they say, for up to a year, and suddenly seemed keen for a chat. The third path is sexting. This is the most depressing and fast becoming the most uncontrollable and ubiquitous aspect of dating young men. In the last few months, 6 promising connections with men under 30, all of them well-educated and seemingly polite, degenerated quickly before meetings that never took place, first into references to sex, then to requests for information on what I like, and then to an unstoppable slew of messages about what they'd like to do to me, what they'd like me to do to them, the current status of their body parts, and then incessant voice notes, body part pictures, and requests for pictures of me. It is inane, tiring, and completely pointless. Zoe concludes, the reality is that what young men really want these days is not action, but talk, not sex, but smut. This may be dismaying to oldies like me, but it is fast becoming the new normal. Well, I guess that's one woman's opinion. Yes. Let's talk about wish fulfillment here. This is from Maclean's magazine. Imagine a conservative party led by Ronna Ambrose. Where would it be now? Contemplating the much-admired, experienced politician as leader of the CPC is speculative political fiction, but it offers some useful insights into the problems currently dogging the party. The curious thing about Ronna Lee Ambrose, that's her full name, until she left politics a couple of years ago, she had never had a job in the private sector. She was a backroom girl. Been in politics pretty much since she left university. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Women's and Gender Studies from the University of Victoria, and a Master of Arts degree in Political Science from the University of Alberta. Oh, she calls herself a libertarian and is a fan of Ayn Rand novels such as Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. Yes, so that would very much appeal to the 2 or 3% of Canadians who are libertarians. So she said something famous in 2005, reading from Wikipedia here. On February 16, 2005, she made headlines after making a remark in Parliament directed at Liberal Social Development Minister Ken Dryden, saying, quote, "Working women want to make their own choices. We don't need old white guys telling us what to do, unquote, in reference to the liberal National Child Care Plan. Yeah, old white guys. Boo! Now, why Ronna Ambrose would be talking about childcare is interesting because she is barren, no children from her, and given that she was born in 1969, this seems unlikely. But this is the fantasy of the Conservative Party of Canada is largely run by PR spivs now. Let's see, and here's one of the experts in this story. What is the problem with Aaron O'Toole? He has a girl's name, but he is a man and leader of the Conservative Party. And being the leader of the Conservative Party means that you're in favor of what 95% of what the Liberal Party agrees with, only maybe you want to take it a little slower. O'Toole himself, according to Shannon Proudfoot, is a Conservative leader straight out of Central Casting. One of the inherent challenges O'Toole faces is that he can do and say things that are different, but he's got to really work at it, according to someone called Matthews. And let's discover who he is. Just give me a second here. Oh, yes. Dennis Matthews is Vice President at Enterprise Canada and former Director of Strategic Communications to Ambrose. He is a PR spiv. Politics in the political commentary in my country is dominated by PR spivs. And before I hear a word from any of these people, I want to see a list of the companies that they represent. So Matthews says, because when you take a quick glance and look at Mr. O'Toole, you've got somebody who's a sterling Conservative candidate, military experience, great family, but he's also, and I don't mean this in a negative sense, he's a middle-aged white guy. Yeah, boo! What have middle-aged white guys ever done for Canada? The people who are behind the scenes in the Conservative Party of Canada, if they think if they could just pivot slightly to the left of the Liberals and the NDP, then they succeed. Now, who represents Conservatives, right-wingers in Canada? Nobody. Nobody at all. You know, Canada has become clown world. Here's a story from CTV News. Major General Danny Fortin, the public face of Canada's vaccine rollout since November, is facing a sexual misconduct claim against him that dates back more than 30 years, CTV News has learned. Sources tell CTV News that military police received a formal complaint against Fortin in March, alleging a historical sexual assault. The incident, sources say, allegedly dates back 32 years to early 1989, when Fortin was a student at the Royal Military College in Saint-Jean, Quebec. The sources, who are not authorized to speak publicly, says Fortin is under investigation for allegedly exposing himself before a woman. You remember something called the statute of limitations? So apparently some woman sat on this complaint for 32 years. And how exactly, Fortin has already been disgraced by this anonymous complaint. How is he expected to defend himself against this? To say, no, I didn't do it? And what, you have a woman who says, yes, he did do it? But you can see what the goal is here, is to replace all of the male generals in Canada's military with female generals. Of course, Canada's military doesn't really have a purpose, so I suppose it doesn't matter. But what is the point of Canada now? Well, apparently it's to speak up for minorities around the world. The piece from National Newswatch by someone called Kanan. The Ontario Legislature on May the 6th passed Bill 104, proclaiming May the 11th to May the 18th as Tamil Genocide Education Week. What appears as a harmless bill to promote education and awareness and to add to the healing process of genocide victims may end up having more implications for Ottawa than the ad hoc bill may appear. The bill is aimed at educating Ontarians about the killing of innocent Tamils in Sri Lanka, particularly during the early months of 2009, the period considered to be the height of the bloody civil war in Sri Lanka, referred to by the United Nations as a bloodbath. The Sri Lankan High Commission in Ottawa was quick to condemn the bill, quote, blatantly false claims, including the grossly exaggerated number of casualties at the conclusion of the conflict in Sri Lanka and allegations of genocide. Why is this an issue in Canada? It's an issue in Canada because there are now hundreds of thousands of Tamils. Now, why they just didn't cross to India, where the closest province is called Tamil Nadu, no, they ended up halfway around the world. And all the political parties in Canada have been infiltrated by supporters of the Tamil Tigers, a terrorist organization. In fact, even Stephen Harper, who was supposedly so very tough on terrorism, he refused to attend a conference in Sri Lanka. And why was this? Oh, to show support for the Tamil Tigers. You had Liberal cabinet ministers showing up at events where they're flying the Tamil Tiger flag. But apparently this is our problem now. Kannan is a legal researcher at Macronet's Law Professional Corporation based in Ontario. He concludes protection of human rights and democracy must remain the epicenter of Canada's foreign policy objectives in an ever-increasingly multipolar world that continues to face simultaneous threats from powerful anti-democratic blocs, People's Republic of China, Russia, North Korea, and their allies. Formulating a principle and value-based foreign policy where we can independently and in partnership strengthen the efforts of our allies is crucial. You know, I'm reminded that some years ago, the Toronto Sun newspaper printed an editorial by a former soldier and a consultant on military matters where he talked, frankly, about the Tamil Tigers. And as a result, they showed up in front of the building and they demanded an apology from the Toronto Sun. And they got one. Kannan concludes, it's time Ottawa props up its game in the international arena and not allow itself to be tossed around by rogue players. How exactly are the Buddhists of Sri Lanka tossing Canadians around? It's not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog that matter, and Canada must position its chips accordingly so that we can take back the golden age and gain foothold back into meaningful engagement in multilateral democracy. Did you enjoy that mixed metaphor pile up there? Let's have a look at the chat. Hello to D. Skibby. Thank you for your compliment. All of those anti-democratic countries, says Steve, aren't ideological in foreign policy. They're not trying to sell their form of government or national values, unlike us. Roulette Crack says, another time I invited a Bulgarian girl to watch me play sound effects on my Roland synth. Okay, I'm not gonna finish that. I am not going to finish that one. The Conservative Party is run by PR spivs. Yes. No, that I didn't invent this phrase, PR spivs. Simon Heffer, the English journalist and biographer, did. And he was referring to David Cameron. David Cameron, very much like Rona Ambrose, suddenly, oh, yes, David Cameron's Conservative leader. What's he done? He's been in the back room for his entire life, ever since he left university. Cameron worked for a year or two for a TV company, Carlton, I believe. And what was his job? His job was representing the company to the government. Yeah, PR spiv. So, oh yes, let's, before I move on to Music Monday, I want to talk about real estate in Canada. Canada is effectively bankrupt now, and the situation isn't going to get any better. But here's a story from Bloomberg. The second largest country in the world is running out of land. Yeah. House prices soaring to the skies. Why would that be the case? Canada's housing market is running hotter than just about anywhere else in the world. This makes no sense whatsoever. But despite the anxiety about irrational bidding wars and fears of the bubble bursting, what's fundamentally driving it is a worsening imbalance between supply and demand. Buyers want large homes, but increasingly can't have them because there isn't enough space in and around the major cities where people work. The world's second biggest country by landmass is effectively running out of space, and that has Canada on course for a reckoning. The dream of a detached home and a piece of land, which generations of Canadians have taken for granted, and which continues to entice new immigrants. Oh, well, yeah, that's what Canadian policy has to be about, is how can we make immigrants happier? It may soon be out of reach in the places where people want to live. That could force an expansion of the idea of home to include condos and rentals, potentially transforming how the middle class does everything from raising families to saving for retirement. Essentially, yes, screw you, middle class. You are not rich enough. Of course, the boomers, holding on to their property, waiting for the market to peak before they cash out. Running out of land in Canada is a relatively recent phenomenon compared to Europe or Japan or other parts of the world, said Robert Hogue, an economist at the Royal Bank of Canada. I think that for future generations, homeownership is going to look a lot more European, for example, than it does today. Again, Canada has decided to abolish the middle class. In Canada, buying a home has long been seen as the surest path to middle-class security. Canadians, on average, live in some of the biggest houses in the world and post higher rates of home ownership than in the UK or France or even the US. The pandemic has put up an even bigger premium on backyards and extra space. Nearly 60% of home sales last year in 18 communities in and around Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Ottawa were for single-family detached houses, according to data compiled from local real estate boards. Only about a quarter of the sales in these places were for apartments. But when you look at what's been built in these same cities and their nearby bedroom communities over the last decade, the percentages are exactly reversed. 60% of new housing stock is apartments and just 25% detached houses, according to government data. That mismatch has forced desperate bidders to vie for an increasingly constrained supply of single-family homes. In 2020, Canada's benchmark home prices gained almost 15%, with only Luxembourg posting a bigger increase. Still, developers don't seem to be responding. Though construction started on a record number of new homes in Canada's metro areas in March, the percentage that were single-family detached actually fell to 19% from 24% the previous year, according to government data. If there is a problem, it's in the composition of the new supply, said Robert Kavsik, an economist with the Bank of Montreal. We don't build single detached homes anymore, and it just so happens from a demographic perspective, that's what the market demands. So we're kind of stuck on that front. So I did the Control F search here for the word immigration. And yes, we have several mentions of the word immigration in this story. But Canada is going to need more apartments too, especially as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau moves to boost immigration to historic records to make up for the pandemic lull. Okay. So there's no suggestion in this story that Canada's relentless pursuit of immigrants has anything to do with the fact that detached housing is no longer affordable for the middle class. Trudeau is bringing in 1.2 million people over the next 3 years. Keep in mind, there's only 38 million people in Canada, and they're all going to have to live somewhere, aren't they? And it's just taken as a given. It's just taken as a given in this story, like, what you gonna do about it? Oh, well, maybe if Canada had decided not to import all of these people from around the world, the middle class would be able to afford detached houses. Here's a story from thedailyhive.com. A group of Canadians fed up with the unaffordability of homes across the country are using a tongue-in-cheek Toronto billboard to draw attention to the issue. The group, called Canada Housing Crisis, sprung from a Reddit forum that started in March of this year. We started talking about getting off the internet and bringing the message into the real world, a representative from Canada Housing Crisis, who wished to remain anonymous, told Daily Hive. People had a bunch of different ideas, and a few mentioned billboards. It seemed like the right mix of publicity stunt and actual messaging. The Toronto billboard, located near Queen and Spadina, cheekily reads, I'll wait for that. Yes, the billboard at Queen and Spadina cheekily reads, "Can't find a home? Have you tried finding richer parents?" The group also put up a similar billboard in Ottawa that reads, "Houses aren't for you, they're for the rich. You can go rent." Both will stay up for 1 month. The group hopes that the billboards would let anyone who is frustrated with the housing market know that there is a group out there trying to work on the issue. Well, yeah, politicians aren't going to do anything about this for lots of reasons. One being is that if you own a home in Canada, you can just sit there. You don't have to do anything. You just get richer and richer and richer and richer. And anything which would lead to a bursting of the bubble is going to anger all of those Canadians who already own houses. So, one last thing before Music Monday. It's a story from Susan Delacourt at the Toronto Star. This federal minister is fighting to have a baby and to prove that motherhood and politics can mix. Now, what do you mean fighting to have a baby? How difficult is it to make a baby? Anyone can do it. Melanie Joly, yes, Joly, a name and in nature, good-looking woman, is spending a lot of time telling women and herself that motherhood and politics can mix. In addition to her job as regional economic minister in Justin Trudeau's cabinet, Joly has also been asked to recruit candidates to run for the Liberals in the next election. Joly, as it happens, is very personally invested in the idea that motherhood shouldn't be an obstacle to a political career like hers. For some months now, this Quebec cabinet minister has been going through fertility treatments, hoping to become a mom at age 42 and add a child to the life she now shares with partner Felix Marzel, owner of a Montreal-based design firm. So presumably, these treatments are gratis. So this woman is 40. She decides she's going to have her first child at 42. Now, presumably, she's been having sexual intercourse for decades and prevented the possibility of children, either with contraception or abortion. But now, at 42, she decides that she's going to have a baby, despite the fact that her fertile years are behind her, and we're all supposed to be rooting for her. You know, in this country, eye examinations are not covered by Medicare, but apparently letting 42-year-old women live out their recently discovered dream of being a mother and, IVF, yes, of course, that gets paid for. So final look at the chat before I move on to Music Monday. Hello to Media Hits. Kevin is stockpiling for Day of the Pillow. Quachilango says Toronto ever more multiculti, ever more sterile. About 80% of immigrants to Canada end up in Vancouver, Toronto, or Montreal. As the Bloomberg article points out, Canada is a very large country, but most of it is effectively uninhabitable, which makes, of course, the concern about global warming in this country to be vastly amusing to me. Oh, yes, temperatures are going to rise 2 degrees Celsius. Well, how exactly would that be a bad thing in Canada? So I'm going to talk about Glenn Gould, most famous Canadian in the world, perhaps. There's a cult around Glenn Gould. I used to be an admirer of his, and then I stopped being an admirer. Part of it has to do, I suppose, with his personality, and part of it has to do with his music. Gould was a fabulist. For instance, his name wasn't Glenn Gould. His name was Glenn, with one N, Gould. Now, it would seem Glenn Gould had a hatred of cliche. And I guess from an early age, he decided that, despite the fact that his mother had prepped him for this, that being a Jewish piano prodigy, he did not want to be known as this. So he essentially invented ancestors from Scotland and from Norway. He claimed some sort of connection with the composer Grieg, and it was all, as I say, made up. Gould, was he a descendant of Edward Grieg? Well, I read it in the Gramophone magazine. The pianist's mother, Florence Gregg, said so, but the late Peter Ostwald noted in his book, highly recommended, Glenn Gould, The Ecstasy and Tragedy of Genius. The Griegs were always very proud of their Scottish Presbyterian background, but they had difficulty tracing it, and the line to the composer was never as clear as Flora and her devoted son, Glenn, wanted it to be. Glenn Gould's engineer was called Andrew Kasdan, and he wrote a memoir. There's lots and lots of memoirs of Glenn Gould out there. I guess he has a rather bitter experience. He said that Glenn Gould once said to him that, because my name is Gould and my father is a furrier, you think that I'm Jewish? which is pretty funny. Let's see. Peter Ostwald wrote, yes, he confirmed that all his Gould's early concert programs bear the name Glenn Gould. A fact completely ignored in every book and article so far written about him. More serious is the false legend that Gould was a saintly aesthete. Not only that, but warm and fun, far from antisocial, as Stephen Posen, his executor, told Phillips. Gould wrote, Gustav Mahler was a very nasty man, blithely indifferent to the fragility of any ego other than his own. Anyone who has ever read the bitter memoir of his former producer, Andrew Kasdan, or Ostwald's highly sympathetic biography, will know that in describing Mahler, Gould was describing himself. Gould discarded his friends, colleagues, and minders like so many used tissues. He forced his father, a man who paid a fortune for his musical education, to abandon his favorite pastime, fishing, because it offended him. He preferred dogs to people and said so. He was gross, slovenly, a drug abuser of rock star proportions, and a hysterical hypochondriac to boot. And his favorite mode of social intercourse was the interminable telephone call, which resulted invariably with his respondent waking up exhausted and seedy on the couch to discover their lector still rabbiting away. Gould died of a stroke in 1982. He had just turned 50 a month before. And such was the cult of privacy around Glenn Gould that his minder, who was paid very, very little money for basically doing everything for Glenn Gould, it was like Stalin. When Stalin had his stroke, everyone was running around tearing their hair out because what do we do? What do we do? We're going to get, if we do the wrong thing, we'll get killed. And with Gould, it would seem that the reason he died was because his minder didn't take him to the hospital for the longest time because he was afraid that Gould would be angry at him for exposing him to, people who Gould hated. Gould effectively produced his own records, and they don't sound good. There's a big difference in the way that North Americans record classical music as opposed to Europeans, a so-called, dry versus a wet approach that American orchestras and instrumentalists have typically they recorded using close miking, which means less reverberation. Gould, though, it's just absolutely shocking how bad his records sound. They sound like they were recorded in, a cardboard box. It's not pleasant to listen to. They have been redone over and over again, and perhaps the remasters have managed to make them more listenable. Years ago, I wrote a piece on the Glenn Gould cult, and my word, such pushback. I never think I've hit hard unless it rebounds, said Dr. Johnson. I was somewhat taken aback by the vehemence of the response, as I failed to understand that criticism of the great man was akin to treason. Treason? Fred Stubbings writes, I find it hard to believe that a Canadian would take such a cheap shot at a fellow Canadian that has earned such a wide reputation all over the world for his genius. But the problem is I don't appraise artists based on their nationality. Gould has earned such a wide reputation all over the world, so he doesn't need me to lay offerings at his shrine. The Gould cult will continue to flourish quite nicely without my support. Besides, ever mindful of my CanCon duty, I did promote Angela Hewitt as an alternative, as I would have done regardless of the color of her passport. Stubbings, this fellow Stubbings accused me of ignorance. One would think that a person with so little knowledge of the subject could keep his opinions to himself. As it turns out, I know rather a lot about Gould. I own 20 of his CDs, mostly J.S. Bach, of course, but also Bizet, the Elizabethans, Grieg, Haydn, Sibelius, Richard Strauss, and Wagner. No Mozart, Beethoven, or Brahms. I'm not a masochist. I've read the books by Jonathan Cott, Otto Friedrich, Andrew Kasdan, Peter Ostwald, and Jeffrey Pezant, plus a coffee table book with a foreword by Herbert von Karajan, the title of which escapes me. I've read Gould's own essays, heard his radio plays, and watched his CBC shows, and his documentary, Glenn Gould's Toronto. It's not a question of ignorance. A woman called Betty Truman, who took the great whiff is off to madness near a line on Gould. She writes, I don't see Kevin Michael Grace or any other Gould basher advocating the boycott of the music of Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms, or Schumann because they were antisocial, weird, possessing of a serious dark side, or mentally ill. Glenn Gould was autistic, for heaven's sake. Autistic? Ostwald, the psychiatrist and musician who was Gould's friend and medical consultant, has the best response to that. Quote, Glenn obviously did not suffer from this disease. Had he been autistic, the remarkable success he had in public career would have been impossible, unquote. Ostwald speculates that Gould might have suffered from Asperger's disease, but this does not release him from moral considerations. For instance, quote, the precipitous dropping of old friends who he thought that they were no longer of any use to him, unquote. Truman also accuses me of believing a preference for animals over people, a moral failing, guilty as charged. And no, I don't advocate the boycott of Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms, or Schumann, or any other artist because of his personal failings. But what evidence does Truman have to prove Mozart and Brahms bad men? I'd be delighted to know either of them. Where Schumann's later years were blighted by general paresis. That is not a mental illness, however. It is an organic disorder. And I'm not going to argue about Beethoven. Bob Tyrrell admits he was a lout, an egomaniac, and a cad, but then there is the matter of art. Art. Beethoven was not merely a virtuoso, he was a creator. As Anthony Burgess pointed out, Rostropovich will be dead one day, but Bach's cello suites will still be heard. Gould had the temerity to savage Mahler as a very nasty man, projection, I believe it's called. I responded that Gould was merely a performer whose achievement is dwarfed by that of any number of giants, including Mahler. Let me go further. I'd gladly trade Gould's entire recorded outbook for any one of Mahler's Wunderhorn songs. The cult of the performer is one of the banes of the modern age. Yes, Gould liked to sing off-key horribly when he made his recordings. Of course, he retired from the stage in 1964, and I guess you could consider Gould to be one of the creatures of the 1960s. That's when the Gould cult really caught on. You see, he didn't perform in public anymore, which made him an object of mystery. And of course, it meant that he didn't make all that much money from his career because, it's the performances that earn money. I guess it was, rather akin to the Beatles. They quit playing in public, what, in 1965 or 1966, or Brian Wilson, leaving the Beach Boys. So this is one of the responses that I got. Gould was the Dylan of classical music. A decade before Dylan, he made people listen to Bach in ways they'd never thought of before, and Beethoven and Mozart and on and on. That he enraged and confounded many with his interpretations, that his 55 and 81 Goldbergs are so remarkably different, is further proof that he is in a completely different category from Horowitz, Rubinstein et al. He offered an entirely different notion of how to read a musical text in performance, closer to John Cage in some respects than Leonard Bernstein. But I don't want a Bob Dylan of classical music. You see, the cult of the performer. No, see, when you buy Glenn Gould's records, you're getting a Glenn Gould record. It may say Bach or Beethoven or Mozart on it. Just everything about this man was just to be deliberately strange. As I say, this famous chair that he sat on that became an object of veneration, which squeaked horribly, which you get on the records. I wrote at the time, let's see, here's another comment. The many Gould CDs, willful or otherwise, I have had occasion to hear bear no evidence of the squeaking chair, or whether or not the voice is groaning is certainly a matter of opinion, to the extent that it's even audible, which is rather seldom. Each to his own, I suppose. Listening to Gould play Haydn the other day, I got that familiar sensation I was sharing a room with Jacob Marley's ghost. What a relief it was to turn to Mikhail Pletnev, no malign spirits and no clattering staccatos, deliberately accentuated at the recording console. My critic said, what set Gould apart from other performers, his genius, if you will, is his seemingly unique ability not merely to interpret Bach et al., but to bring him to life, to the point that a Gould performance became quite literally a joint creation of Gould and the composer in question. But I don't hold with the joint creation ideal. The performer should be content to be the creator's handmaiden. Anything else is a hubris. Years ago, after the Gould cult was decried by Tamara Bernstein in the National Post, I had the good fortune to interview Robert Silverman. Professor Silverman, who teaches at the University of British Columbia, is, of course, a pianist of considerable renown himself. He told me Gould was one hell of a great pianist, but there was something wrong with the man. Silverman was greatly hurt by what he called Gould's perversions, quote, the way he ruined Brahms, the way he ruined Mozart, the way he ruined Beethoven. The apologists are saying how postmodern, how au courant, how Derrida-ish, Silverman said. You record a piece not to convey the sense of the music, but your take of it, deliberately sabotaging it. But maybe I'm not as smart as those academics who are drawn to it. Too modest by half. I'd say Robert Silverman is more than smart enough. It's the postmodernists who are stupid. Or maybe we were all flailing for the wrong end of the stick. Professor Silverman said something that has haunted me ever since. I view so much of what Gould did as having fun at our expense, a put on. I've always thought that Glenn Gould was a fine comedian. Unlike most of his cultists, I do not cringe at Karl-Heinz Kloppweiser and his Ein Panzer-Symphonie. I laugh out loud. Perhaps this is the best explanation of the Gould enigma. Perhaps all of it, the close, the moans, the conducting, the chair, the chickering, the funereal tempos, the maniacal tempos, the ecstatic grimace, the Garrett pose, the humanist pose, perhaps all of it was simply a joke. If this is true, then Andy Kaufman had better look to his laurels. So, let's see what's coming up on the show after the break. Let's see, I'm going to be talking about, I've lost it here. Okay. I have not got the list in front of me. Cultured Drugs is the book for this week that I will discuss on Friday. And The Friends of Eddie Coyle, a neo-noir film directed by Peter Yates and starring Robert Mitchum from 1973. I will be discussing on theater Thursday. I rewatched the film a couple of days ago, and it's very much a 1970s film. Location shooting. I don't know whether there's any studio used in this. It all seems to be done on location. And you would think Massachusetts in autumn, going to be pretty, right? Not in this movie, it isn't. And I guess that's a deliberate choice, that I suppose that people who live desperate lives, they look at the world in a different way. That the beauty of it is they are largely immune to it. So that is the show for today. Franz Liszt is Kevin's favorite pianist. Well, my favorite pianist, I mentioned Angela Hewitt. I like her a lot. Charles Rosen's Goldbergs are very good. So are Wilhelm Kempf's. I love Kempf. He was a true humanist, unlike Glenn Gould. Yeah. Let's see. Ron Mayle must be a fan. He and Russell took a photo with the Gould statue down on Front Street when they were in Toronto. A lot of people, I think it was Tamara Bernstein who first commented that there's a statue of Gould, and he's sitting on a bench, with his flat cap. And this statue reminds a lot of people of what a sex pest would look like. So that is Stropovich. Okay. Okay. So Head McNeck says, I went to my local bar to enjoy a cold beer and some Kevin with my headphones. At 3 minutes before lunch, my buddy shows up and starts talking my ear off. I'll have to catch it later. Okay. 20 short stories about Glenn Gould. I think it was Lucas Foss, the American conductor and composer, that he found out that he was having an affair with Foss's wife, that she read Cosmopolitan magazine, that Gould saw it, on a coffee table or whatever. And then he started haranguing her about, no, it was Andrew Kasdan's wife. He started haranguing her about reading Cosmo. And he demanded that she would agree to never read the magazine again. And I'm rather surprised, he didn't get tossed out on his ear. But, since he was such a genius, he got away with behavior that would be considered intolerable in other people. So that's it for tonight. I'll be back on the air tomorrow and the rest of the week at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you would click on the like button, subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you'd like to make a donation to this live stream, very much appreciated, especially at this time in my life. My PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, you can make a donation directly to this live stream via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.